Welcome to part 2, Freedom of Speech, Expression and Tolerance in Islam when it comes to debates, and does Islam allow criticism and so forth. If you haven't seen part 1, please watch it. We go through the evidences from the Quran and the Hadith that Islam encourages debate, open criticism and freedom of speech in a respectable way to allow debate and discourse to take place between Islam and non-Muslims. In this part, we'll also be going into secular double standards and their claims of freedom of speech and tolerance, because if they're going to attack Islam and make claims about Islam being intolerant, then they need to take the other end of the stick, and we will show them the double standards and inconsistencies of their arguments when the argument can be applied to their own systems. Now, I want to point out that there is a role that Muslims can take when their prophet is criticized. Remember what we said earlier? We said that when the prophet is mocked severely and criticized, in the Western world, of course, we do not call for cartoonists to be killed and shot and all these sorts of things. This is terrorism and not part of Islam, and anyone who does it in the name of Islam is wrong and they need to be dealt with. The Quran says in Surah Al-Imran, verses 3 to 120, it says, "But if you remain patient and become al-muttaqun, pious, not the least harm will their cunning do to you." So we are commanded to be patient according to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So what does it mean to be tolerant in Islam when it comes to freedom of speech and freedom of expression? As you know, in the Western world, certain insults or mockery is not tolerated, and there could be heavy consequences to that. For example, if you wanted to be a sexist, if you wanted to racially vilify someone, if you wanted to be anti-Semitic, if you held a high position of authority, you'll actually lose your job and fines can be applied, and under racial vilification laws you could actually end up in prison for reoffending and making nasty remarks and so forth towards individuals. So if the West can set moral laws and moral punishments, then why do they actually criticize Islam if it admonishes or chastises someone for doing the same when it comes to the Prophet of Islam or the religion itself? Now remember, I didn't use in any of my statements that you should kill them. So don't go ahead and put that as, oh look, he's saying we should admonish them, when in part 1 he didn't speak about killing those who insult Islam. So why is he saying it now? Well, I'm not saying it now. And punishment doesn't mean that you should kill them. It could mean simply you could imprison them under a Sharia law. They could possibly be flogged, and of course maybe they could be imprisoned. So it doesn't mean you should kill them. Now you may turn around and say, well, what do you mean by flog? Are you saying that if I simply criticize Islam, I should be disciplined and so forth? Well, no, not necessarily. See, an anti-Islamist will say, oh, soon as an anti-Muslim or a Islamophobe says something insulting towards the Prophet, then this requires a punishment. No, not necessarily. It depends on the context. Is he an activist to activate war during his criticism of the Prophet Muhammad? And if he's not doing that, then what kind of discipline does this require? And of course, if the anti-Islamist says something like, hey, look, I have a genuine question about Islam. I heard that your prophet, he practiced child marriages. So can you please answer these questions? See, Islam has got no problem in addressing this person. But if this person is starting to draw all these pictures of Prophet Muhammad in bed with little children and slandering the Prophet and spreading all this disease and fabrication and lies and trying to discredit the Prophet and turn him into a pedophile and all these sorts of things, then this person doing such a thing should be punished, because he's not being genuine, he's running his mouth wild, he's basically he's jumped on an opinion and he's trying to constantly slander the Prophet and abuse his name. So basically, this person is not a genuine person. He is not interested in answers. He's only there to mock Islam and is part of mockery. So in this case, discipline is put forward. So if he lives under an Islamic state or an Islamic country, then it is possible that he could be arrested and told not to do what he's doing and to be respectful. This is only part of being respectful. And if he continues, maybe he could be imprisoned, maybe flogged. That depends on the Sharia court and the Sharia system. It's part of discipline. Now, if I wanted to insult black people, if I started insulting feminists or gay people or anti-Semitism, in the West, they will also use forms of imprisonment. They will use forms of intimidation such as boycott, or they'll make me lose my job, or they'll give other forms of chastisement, discipline, and punishment. So it's interesting that when the West enforces certain punishments for foul insults and disrespect, then apparently this is okay. But if an Islamic state or a constitution does the same, then it becomes intolerant. Do you see the double standards? So yes, Islam, like Western lands and morality, it requires respect in dialogue and discussion. Now, in the West, I may be a racist. It's true, I could be a racist. There are racists in the West. But there is a difference between a racist who is asking genuine questions than a racist that is abusing and attacking a person in the street. You see, so Islam says, look, you can be an Islamophobe, you can be an Islamic critic if you want to ask genuine questions in respectful tone and respectful manner. There is no problem. We can entertain your question and address it. But if you're going to run your mouth wild and slander the Muslims and slander the Prophet Muhammad in the most degrading, disrespectful way, then discipline is required under an Islamic state, just like the Western Hemisphere does certain things to discipline those under a vilification act. Here in Australia, for example, in Victoria, there are laws against the Racial Vilification Act in Victoria, that if you are caught abusing a person, for example, on the train or the bus, you are heavily penalized with fines or even imprisonment. Does one say, oh, look at secularism, look at Western secularism, look at the morality, is this the intolerance? It cannot debate, or you cannot allow people with freedom of speech to become racist? Do we then criticize the West and the media not allowing freedom of speech of individuals? No. Of course, their argument would be that you shouldn't be a racist because racism, unlike religion, is not a choice. And of course, they bring up these arguments. But that doesn't really matter what arguments you bring up, and I'm pretty sure they are good justifications to why you shouldn't be a racist. But the fact that you don't allow a person to be a racist is a form of oppression to that person, because you're not allowing that person to express his freedom of speech. What I'm merely showing is that freedom of speech and expression is suppressed. And even some Islamophobes in the West, they actually critique the Australian government. There's a particular law that they wish to see it changed because under that law, apparently they can't be Islamophobic because it puts religious people under that notion of religious and racial vilification. So they want to actually change that law in order to abuse Muslims in the most horrendous ways. So even in the West, certain freedoms are protected and at the same time they are unprotected. So why are they playing this double standard game when it comes to Islam, disciplining those who vigorously insult Muslims or Islam in the most harshest tones and matters? And these are racists and Islamophobes in Australia, for example. They want these laws so that they can be changed, the racial vilification code, in order to, of course, slander Muslims and racially abuse them, such as call them ragheads and sand niggers, and all of these awful languages without with disrespect. See, the Australian Constitution wants to hold a value that, hey, look, you can do freedom of speech, but it needs to be in a respectful tone, in a respectful manner. Islam holds such a view as well, yet it is criticized for holding it. But the same Islamophobes are actually also criticizing their governments as well. So it's interesting because you see a clear inconsistency here. They argue and say, the same Islamophobes, they will say, oh, we're sick of having political correctness because political correctness doesn't allow us to slander and insult Muslims. So they actually have a go at their own parties for being too politically correct. I personally hold a neutral view. I think political correctness, I agree, it can be wrong and it can be right. For example, political correctness says that homosexuals, it should be respected in the sense that it's natural, it's part of human life, and that you shouldn't discredit homosexuality and you should accept homosexuality. This is what political correctness teaches us. So in that aspect, I would disagree to political correctness just because the masses and our politicians say this is how we should behave and this is how we should view the act of homosexuality. I can, of course, have a disagreement to that. So in one way, political correctness can be wrong. I understand that. And I totally understand the Islamophobic claims when they want to separate themselves from political correctness. But in the same token, I think political correctness can be right. For example, when the majority and the human beings living under a Western hemisphere, under a morality and under a democracy, they obviously vote upon their morals and ethics. And under a democracy, of course, if they vote that a certain act is forbidden, such as disrespecting another person in a most vigorous, harsh way, is not correct, then of course I can agree to that political correctness. So like I said, political correctness can have a right token and it could also have a wrong token. And this is why in Islam we encourage to stick to the political correctness of our Quran and our Hadith, where we get our moral lessons and behaviors from and our ethics. And of course, we can accept the Australian law or the secular law as long as it doesn't contradict the verses of the Quran. It's interesting because apparently Islamophobic racists, of course, have had enough of today's political correctness. They sob because under anti-racial laws, their freedom of speech and freedom of expression is not tolerated. And now we're going to expose the Western standards, because they like to champion to the world how they are the champions of freedom of speech and liberalism. So basically, these Islamophobes who have had enough of political correctness, they sob because under anti-racial laws, their freedom of speech and freedom of expression is not tolerated, because they can't slander Muslims and insult Muslims in the most vigorous way. And if they do, Australian law can actually deal with such individuals for religious hate crimes. And these could be verbal abuse. So my question to the Islamophobes is as follows. Sure, I agree with the Islamophobes on this one about, political correctness can have an effect on silencing people because they wish to disrespect others. They want these laws to diminish so they can disrespect others. So my question to them would be as follows. Can I then disrespect you? And now I'm arguing with you with a rational argument. Can I then disagree and disrespect you in the most vigorous way by saying things like, in the public hemisphere, all white people are barbaric like their Anglo history? Can I say white people and white Christians have raped a lot of children in church? I think they are genetically prone to raping children because it's genetically embedded through their forefathers. Would this be tolerated? Would these harsh criticisms be respected? What if I say, one day I would like to urinate on the gravestones of fallen Australian diggers? I will do it on a rainy day, so not to worry, the rain will wash it away. Would that be accepted? Would that be tolerated? What if I said, I would like to draw a satire picture of a fallen Australian digger making fun of them in mockery pictures? An Australian digger is a veteran that has died in previous wars. What if I said I would like to appear on Western media and tell people that gay people are a plague to society? What if I said I want to say that I'm Muslim first, then Australian second, and not the other way around? What if I said Kafirs are unclean people? What if I said all Jews are pigs and monkeys? Will my freedom of speech be tolerated and my difference of opinion respected or suppressed in the Western Hemisphere? So notice some Islamophobes may come to you and say, sure, see, we live in a liberal world. We live in freedom of speech. We won't punish you. We will allow you to speak your mind. Well, that's just a bunch of nonsense. That is a bunch of lies, okay? They will say to you, yes, sure, go ahead, speak your mind, but we will make sure you never even dare to open your mouth. We will make sure that you will dare not to open your mouth ever again. This is the Western treatment of freedom of speech. Yes, they will make you lose your job. They'll throw you out of office. They'll call for your resignation. If you wanted to enter President Turnbull, Malcolm Turnbull's iftar party, the whole Australian public will condemn it and say you are not invited. The president should not ever sit in a gathering with a Muslim who holds such views. Yes, those views should not be held, and you will not be held in an iftar party. You will be rejected from an iftar party. And this is what they did with a Muslim called Sheikh Shadi. Of course, Turnbull was at an iftar party, the president, and there was an Islamic cleric there as well who held different views from Australian morality And there was a whole condemnation why he actually sat in that gathering. Why was this imam invited into such gathering, and why was our president participating in such a iftar gathering with that man present at that event? So notice, the Islamophobes have a standard. Where is the tolerance? Where is the respect? Where is the respect of another person's opinion? So the double standards is, if you want to establish the real freedom of speech, then why don't you allow people to make fun of anything and everything without any limit? And since when did freedom of speech come with limitations? So the West want to impose freedom of speech on their code of conduct, yet expect everyone else to accept their code of conduct when it comes to freedom of speech. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that you're saying we express and we allow freedom of speech, but then you say that freedom of speech is limited. So why do you insult and express condemnations against Islam and Muslims for being intolerant, yet you define in your script what is acceptable free speech and what is not acceptable free speech? Yet when Islam does the same thing, you then criticize Islam for being intolerant, yet turn a blind eye to your own systems and values. And of course, they'll give justifications. And let's go through some of those justifications that they give, that some speeches should not be acceptable. Yet, why is it defined? Why do they get to define what is acceptable and what is not? See, I, from a Muslim position, could say what is acceptable and what is not. It's not acceptable to insult the Prophet in the most harshest ways. Well, can you prove my argument not to be wrong? No, you can't, because that will be subjective. Just like your arguments are subjective when it comes to your definitions of freedom of speech and what you think is acceptable and not. And of course, there are arguments such as freedom of speech, and they would always argue and make the claim Islam is not a race, it's a religion, therefore it can be criticized. And this is how to counter such an argument. How to refute the argument of a liberal secularist that tells you we shouldn't be allowed to be racist because race is not a choice, but religion is a choice, therefore it can be mocked under freedom of expression. I'm sure you have heard this argument a number of times when Muslims point out to the secular liberals, why is race hate speech not tolerated, but religion hate speech is? You can hear many secular atheists make that argument. First, sure, we can agree that race and religion is two separate things. But why are we told to believe in freedom of speech according to Western definition? And why is the West defining what is acceptable free speech and what is not? Is that not the very same attitude religious criticize with throughout history? Because religious dogma would often put restrictions on what is acceptable speech and what is not. Notice the secularists are doing the very same thing religion was blamed for doing, that is defining what is acceptable and what is not. Secondly, who said freedom of speech comes with conditions? This in itself proves inconsistencies. Under the title of freedom, why don't you change the title to limited freedom of speech instead of freedom of speech? Since the freedom of expression promoted here in reality comes with conditions. You see, if the West changed the term, they really wouldn't look like the world leaders of bearers of torch for freedom of speech and expression, now would they? Third, one can argue that homosexuality is a choice like religion is a choice, but in today's world you can be prosecuted for homophobic remarks. Of course, most people will argue homosexuality is not a choice because you are born with it. However, there is no science to prove this. In fact, even today, we find sick pedophiles making the same arguments as homosexuals, that they are born with desires in their attraction towards minors. even has academic backing. You can read it here, and I'll post the link from the Telegraph below this video and you can read it for yourself. Of course, even after research proving the natural behavior of tendency, no liberal will accept this excuse even after academic backing. But for some reason, this excuse of being born with it or having natural feelings is perfectly acceptable when it comes to the act of homosexuality. Why is that? Now, you may ignore this point and give all these excuses to why homosexuality is not the same argument for pedophilia, but one thing you cannot deny is the very fact that homosexual individuals can choose to be straight, which defeats their whole argument that homosexuality choice, you're born with it, and that they say, you cannot choose to be anything else. Well, I say that's a bunch of nonsense. You can read this report of a homosexual lesbian going from being attracted to only females after intense natural therapy is now attracted to men. You can read the article from CNN programs, and I'll post a hyperlink below this video. So I wonder now that since it is proven homosexuality can be a choice, will it be tolerated under freedom of speech laws to say what you like to the homosexual community, according to these liberals? Therefore, we would like to see some consistency, which we don't generally see under race, anti-Semitism, sexism, are all protected except for religious vilification in most of the Western world, which actually endorses violence. Therefore, their argumentation of something being a choice can be insulted and so forth, whereas something that can't be a choice can't be insulted or shouldn't be insulted is basically nonsensical. As we've provided, homosexuality is not necessarily a choice and can be there could be therapy and so forth to change that person. We're not basically like robots and we're just designed one way. Of course, the media and the homosexual community would want to portray that to be as follows, but there's arguments against that. But I'm just showing you merely that simply something being no choice doesn't necessarily mean you can't criticize it, because that goes against the value of freedom of speech. And we know that people do choose, well, it doesn't matter what that may be, and it should be criticized. I agree, it should be criticized, but in a respectful way. And if you criticize it in a disrespectful way, with abuse after abuse after abuse, and then it takes the threshold into a disrespect term, then all moral laws, all Western laws should hold on to that political correctness to then shun that person and silence that person when his criticism goes out of hand. And we know that the Western Hemisphere already does this. If a person is now protesting and he's starting to cross the line and push the francs and push the lines, of course, the security guards will deal with such individuals. They'll put restraining orders against them and so forth. So when people cross limits, there's always a threshold. That's where Islam says, hey, you're going to be disciplined for that, so just be careful. And that's where Western laws do the same thing. And I don't dispute this. I think it's a good thing, and that respect and honor should take precedence over people who are just running their mouth wild without any legitimacy. And like I said, we see so many double standards and inconsistencies, people saying the wrong things all the time in the media, and they're told to step down from their position. And that's just the reality of a double standard society that claims freedom of speech. And of course, we can get into all of these arguments such as religious freedom and so forth, and people are still condemned for the choices that they make. There are certain religious practices that a person may do, such as building churches or building mosques or doing other certain acts, such as, for example, if you wanted to have a polygamous relationship, this is banned in certain Western hemispheres. So freedom of expression and freedom of religion is not actually always tolerated in the West. I'm only bringing these points up to show you that when you criticize Islam or Islamic countries because it may take certain freedoms away, well, there are moral standards even in the West where your freedoms and your laws prevent you from having your freedoms and so forth. For example, you can't exactly walk on the street naked. And if you do, you'll have a police officer come to you, and for public nuisance of being naked, you could be imprisoned or you could get hefty fines. So when the Islamophobes like Ayaan al-Hirsi want to promote liberalism, when they want to go out and slander Muslim countries and say, look at those Muslim countries, it forces women to wear a hijab. Yet the Western Hemisphere, if you don't wear clothes, you could be imprisoned. If you go naked in the street, you could be fined for public nuisance and nudity. So notice they define their own rules and regulations and punish people accordingly, but when Muslim countries have certain rules and regulations due to moral code and dress code, then it's seen as an oppressive regime. It's seen as we need to go and liberate these people from such oppressive dictatorship. It's just amazing with the double standards. We'll express more hypocrisy, and all of these links I'll publish below this video in the description section so you can see the double standards for yourself. Western hypocrisy, cartoons, freedom of pens fight terrorism. You can read the hyperlinks here. There are double standards because they like to criticize Charlie Hebdo and say, we're against that. Charlie Hebdo, where they went out and shot people and so forth. But even when you look at the French government and when you look at certain Western laws, they also give limited free speech and expression. And here are some of those examples. Freedom of speech. You can be anti-Islam, anti-Muslim prophet, but not anti-Semite or anti-racist or anti-nationalist. Discrimination, favoritism. A man drawing ideas under freedom of expression is being prosecuted. This is according to the Independent UK, where a man under drawing ideas, drawing cartoons, is being prosecuted for that. And I'll put the hyperlink below this video. An Australian newspaper was forced to remove cartoons about Gaza showing anti-Semitism, which actually has nothing to do with the Holocaust and nothing to do with race. But the Australian newspaper had to write a column where it had to remove and apologize for drawing pictures of Gaza and showing the Israelites in the bad light. The Zionists showing them in the bad light for Palestinians. They had to apologize and remove such cartoons. So where is the double standards here? And you can see the proof and the evidence below this video. Our Australian government did that. It removed these cartoons. So where were these Islamophobes and critics, and where were these liberation police like Ayaan al-Hirsi condemning the Australian newspaper for removing and apologizing for disrespecting the Israeli government by drawing cartoons about their occupation in Israel? A Muslim French woman banned from wearing a head covering. That's according to The Guardian. There you go, freedom of expression taken away from Muslims. And this is the burqa ban in France. President Holanda, under freedom of expression, banned the performance of a Commedian Diebonnda for Anti-Sematics claims, and we'll publish all of these articles below this video. A French rapper is prosecuted in court for calling France an SLUT, I don't want to say the word, and insulting Napoleon. A on trial for anti-Semitism, again, it's according to the Telegraph, UK. Rupert Murdock, this is a guy that runs Fairfax, I believe it is, and the Herald Sun. He apologizes to Netenyahu for publishing anti-Semitic cartoons about him. And again, nothing to do with race or the Holocaust. And we'll publish the article below. Mike Carlton was forced to resign after making anti-Semitic comments. And you can see that again, we'll publish that. No outrage for Palestinian cartoonist who is arrested and jailed in Israel. And again, we'll publish all of that. A French court bans religion advertising by the BBC UK. A Muslim man arrested for hate speech. This is according to Yahoo News. And more double standards. You can make fun of the Prophet of Islam, but not about the Holocaust. The media double standards, and we'll publish the link below. So yes, in the Western Hemisphere, you could be punished and, of course, dealt with for certain actions. And so if Islamic countries punish and admonish those people and discipline them, then why do they have a problem with that? So I'm of the Muslim opinion, this is my opinion, I believe that you shouldn't be flogged, nor should you punish them with the jail, nor should you fine them with money. I believe that criticism should be opened, no matter how harsh it is, because my opinion is that you should just turn away from those people, because the Quran actually says that if you find them mocking your prophet or mocking Allah, then turn away from them, because the actual Quran verse says that, and I'll post it in the hyperlink below this video. It actually says turn away from them until they come back to good speech and respectful speech. Then you can engage them again. I think that's what we should do. And of course, if you want to boycott them, you could do things like that. If you want to write letters to their organizations condemning their actions and their vile hate speech, then I think this is the most recommended thing. But the point that I wanted to make is, when you slander Muslim countries who have a difference of opinion, and they may not, if they kill, then I think it's wrong. But if they flog or do other discipline measures, then that could be a difference of opinion. It doesn't mean I agree to that. But even if they do that, it doesn't prove they are intolerant, because the Western Hemisphere, although it may not flog people, it still imprisons them, fines them, and does other torturous punishments like make them lose their jobs and all those sorts of things. So let's make a distinction that if you're blaming Islamic countries for doing certain disciplines against vile, harsh criticism, then your own Western hemispheres do the same, then there's a double standard and a hypocrisy on your part. But my belief, honest belief, is that you should turn away from them and, respond in peace. Because Allah says, and the Prophet Muhammad says, and I'll put the links below this video and you can see for yourself, that when the fools mock you and say nasty things, then you should reply in peace and turn away from them until they engage in good speech, and then you can give them dawah. This is, I believe, the Muslim true position. But of course, there are differences of opinion, and if there are differences of opinion and other scholars admonish and call for the punishment of those who vigorously, violently insult Islam, then your Western Hemisphere does exactly the same and calls for certain punishments, then I'll call you out for your double standards and your hypocrisy. If you're criticizing Islamic countries while your own countries also discipline those who make disrespectful comments against racism or sexism or homophobia or anti-Semitism. And it's also interesting to point out, according to the Western world, they not only want people not to have a difference of opinion, you need to have an opinion and accept their political correctness. So they actually force you to accept their outlook on life. For example, when they say you have freedom of speech and freedom of expression, it has to be according to their understanding and morality. A great example is a school in Sydney, Australia, criticised Muslim students for not shaking the hands of non-Muslim women between sexes. And they clearly criticised these Muslim kids because they were on the freedom of expression to choose not to shake hands of opposite sex. But the Australian Political Correctness Constitution said no. The government officials or people in the field of politics said no, you live in Australia. If you live in Australia, you can't have your freedom of speech and expression. Your freedom of expression needs to be in line with Western morality. Can you imagine if we said that if you happen to visit a Muslim country, then you can't bring your Australian morals over there and your ethics. Everything needs to be in line with Sharia. You need to think like a Sharia Muslim and you need to accept everything under Sharia. Now, you would say there's no freedom of speech there. You would say that's intolerant. You would say Islam does not accept diversity, wouldn't you? So when it comes to secularism and your laws, why do you then force people to accept your terms of freedom of speech and expression? Why do you not allow those Muslims to have and express their own freedom of speech and expressions? You see the double standards here. You force Muslims to accept your morals, but when you go to Muslim countries, you then complain if you are under a Sharia system and you need to accept those moralities. Now, you as a critic might say, how about we look at Saudi Arabia? How about we look at Tunisia? How about we look at Morocco? How about we look at these places where it bans women from driving and it puts all these bans and restrictions? Go see over there how much oppression and things that people face and discriminations. Whereas in the West, if you come here in the West, you need to live under our moral laws and under our ethics. And they say, if you don't like it, then why don't you just go back to those countries? But you see, there's a double standards here. You see, at least some of those Muslim countries are honest and they upfront tell you things that are not acceptable. And they'll tell you up front what they accept and what they don't accept. But here in the West, we see more of a hypocrisy. They will tell you under the cover of enlightenment and freedom of speech, we allow you freedom of religion. We allow you freedom of expression. But when you do it, they say, no, that's not according to our freedom of expression and opinion and thought process. They say you need to confine to ours and put that rubbish away, put those religious practices away, put those mindset and thoughts aside. We do not tolerate that. You see the double standards. So they take you away from the podium, they tell you to resign from your position, and you're given the back door, basically. It's like, see you later, on your bike, you lose your position of authority, and you're criticized. You know, people like Walid Ali, for example, soon as a man is given freedom of speech, they start character assassinating him, saying all sorts of evil things about him, and at the same time make him wish he never said those words. And they also call for the deportation of people like Walid Ali and call for him to lose his job and things like that. So when influential people speak against some Western policies, automatically your freedom of speech is not tolerated and it's shunned into the corner. We don't see this. We don't basically see Islamophobes come out and say, look, as a Muslim, I respect that you've got a difference of opinion. You can still keep your job, but we respect you for your differences of opinion and, you know, different ideas and things like that. But look, we'll just agree to disagree. No, see, the conversation doesn't end there. They will criticize you, they will insult you, and they'll tell you to resign and stand down from your position. So it's a huge gap of hypocrisy. Please also watch my video below, which I'll attach. Ayan Ali Hirsi was actually granted a visa. She was a hate preacher. She was actually granted a visa to come to Australia. However, a Muslim who wanted to tour Australia and preach about the crimes that were committed by the Israeli government against the Palestinian people, he was actually denied a visa to come and preach here in Australia, and his freedom was actually taken away from him. And I'll post the video below this video, so you can see a clear level of suppression no matter where you go, whether it's, you know, some Muslim countries you'll see suppression, whether it's secular Western hemispheres. I just want to point out this argument to the Islamophobes. This is a really interesting one. Every time we hear right-wing groups like Pauline Hanson say things like there should be a Muslim ban or Islam is a disease, I challenge her supporters to replace the word Muslim, Islam with Jew, and then ask themselves if they sound like Nazis. So imagine if Pauline Hanson said a ban on Jews and Judaism is a disease. We actually challenge her supporters to say such things like that, and you will see how the whole Australia will condemn them. But, again, Judaism is not a race. But then when you do the same thing to Islam and Muslims, it's completely tolerated to say such horrendous things. So it's incredible. The double standards are incredible. Islamophobe, this is what an Islamophobe will say. For example, he'll say, Muslims are trying to suppress freedom of speech in this beautiful country of ours. These are the ones living in Australia, by calling our criticism of Islam and Muslims as hate speech. But my response to that would be, imagine if I said, I don't like the act of homosexuality, I think it's a plague to society. An Islamophobe would say, shut up, you Muslim, that's hate speech. So notice what is acceptable hate speech and what is not acceptable hate speech.